Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And this week, we're talking about Christian patriarchy. We're talking about women living in fundamentalist households and the abuse and manipulation that they suffer by their spouses and their religious leaders. Joining me in studio is FFRF Legal Fellow and Attorney Sammi Lawrence. Hi, Sammi.
Hi, it's great to be here, and as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. Please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show.
So joining us today, we have a special guest, Tia Levings. She's the author of the new memoir, A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. Thank you so much for joining us, Tia. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
So, Tia, we're going to just start with the basics. We talk about this subject a lot, but you bring a different perspective. So I want to hear how you define Christian patriarchy and what it means to be a well-trained wife, what that title kind of meant for you in your life.
Yeah, sure. Those are two really big questions, so I'm going to separate them out a little bit. I sometimes call Christian patriarchy the evangelical patriarchy, and I think it's important to distinguish it from like historic Christianity that involves, like, for example, the Catholicism, the Pope. That is a patriarchal version of Christianity. That's the roots. That's not really what's happening in America right now, is this trend of a Protestant patriarchy where the father is the head of the household. There's complementary gender roles. There's not an inclusion for progress or evidence or science or psychology, any kind of modern thought. And it is really hearkening back more to a puritanical version of Christianity, such as in the 1500s when my mind just went blank on what we call them, Columbus. The Pilgrims came to America and settled. That is a much clearer portrayal of what evangelical patriarchy is trying to achieve in religion. I sometimes refer to it just as the evangelical patriarchy because it is pretty much a Protestant movement. It does have some carryover into the traditional Catholic movement, but that's small, and it also shows itself in Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, and other non-Baptist, Presbyterian, like evangelical realms. So a well-trained wife is a play on scripture we use in the Christian patriarchy. We cling to a verse in the Old Testament that says, happy is the man that has a quiver full of arrows. You want to have as many arrows. Children are weapons for war as you can. When you go into war, you want to have as many arrows. So you clearly want to have as many children if you're fighting a war against the West. And it ties into another verse in Psalms that says, train up a child in the way they should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So this idea that you're training children, you're also training your wife. The man in control is training his underlings and submissives. That is where it came from.
Thank you for talking a little bit more about that. I think that the evangelical movement is something that we have observed a lot here at FFRF and how it's starting to play out in our laws and our society in a much more visible way. For our viewers, can you also tell us a little bit about how you personally got involved in fundamentalism and how you were indoctrinated into this very fundamentalist, quiverful, IBLP lifestyle?
Yeah, I think my background is very important to show how it has changed in the American movement. There's a tendency to look at the Institute of Basic Life Principles, for example, which is Bill Gothard's organization, or certain different congregations as fringe or isolated into a single entity. And my story is very common, but it's not well told and not broadly told yet. And it is a kind of a carryover from the mainstream. So I grew up just in a regular mainstream American Christian that went to church. Christmas, Easter, was something in our lives, part of our Christian tradition in our family. Definitely important. God was talked about, said my prayers before bed, normal light things. People can relate to that. Then we moved to Jacksonville, Florida when I was 10, and my parents joined a Southern Baptist megachurch. We had 20,000 people on the roll by the time I was an adult. And my pastor was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So this is not a fringe or unusual group. But what's important about it is that in the late 80s and 90s, the evangelical church, especially in the Southern Baptist denomination, was becoming more political and fundamentalist as the same years that I was growing up. So that 10-year period through the 90s. And so when I become when I'm 19 and I'm like confronting fundamentalism, that's not what my parents were joining back when I was 10. You know, they thought we're just going to go to a big church where it's going to give our children a lot of opportunities to have a safe childhood and a social life, and it'll be protected. They had no idea that that's where it was going to lead. And then I got married at 19, and the fundamentalist influences in our churches was there as a resource, as a sanctioned resource.
I think that's so important, Tia. And reading your book, it really struck me how your parents aren't fundamentalists. Like, so, you know, the work we do at FFRF is trying to, you know, it's not our job to, like, contrary to what our adversaries might characterize our work as, stamp out religion, you know, from the culture. It's to keep religion and government separate, especially in the places where governmental power can be used to do the work of missionaries or exploit it. And we see that the most prominently in the public schools. And I think what's so important about your story and interesting about sort of the origin story of your fundamentalist existence is that, like, your parents weren't fundies. They thought, like so many parents, church equals good. And so if I put my kids in this church environment, they'll be exposed to good things. They'll have youth group, and they'll have choir, and they'll have good news club, and, you know, all of these things that it's like, it's harmless. It's thought of this sort of supportive thing, but, you know, it's not being directed necessarily by the parents. And so as the fundamentalist movement is getting more political and more sort of predatory, I mean, I think it was the perfect storm of terrible timing for you, but it's also a story that we see so much in the work we do, which is just these groups just trying to kind of get their you know, get their pincers into young people and really train them up in this fundamentalist movement from there. And it may or may not have anything to do with their parents' actual directing the religious upbringing of their kids. And that's what I think is so dangerous and exploitative about religion. And that's why we try to keep it so separated from public schools, where if it's not intentionally being directed by a parent, then it really should be nowhere near, you know, like other people's kids. And I think your parents obviously did nothing wrong. You know, they did what so many parents do, which is just think like this has to be a good, positive influence. It's a proxy for some of those other things that we don't always know how to approximate for our kids in the secular world.
Yeah, that was a really big part of my deconstruction process after I got out, and I had to look at, how did I end up in this situation? Why did I make these decisions? And there's a very common narrative that your parents did it to you, but that wasn't the case with mine. And so I had to look at this place, which was my faith, that I wasn't expecting. You know, I was presented faith as a comfort, and it was confrontational for me to realize that it wasn't. It was causing all this pain. It was causing all this dysfunction. And the fruit of my faith was not anything what was promised. And that turned out to be the important key, because fundamentalism promises, and that's what they were doing in a very predatory, high marketing way. I mean, when you go to a megachurch, the money is flowing, and the marketing and the advertising was there. And young parents who want the best thing for their family, which is always what's tempting about fundamentalism, is that you want happy families, you want happy children, you want happy marriages. You're looking for structure and organization in your chaos. And the church says, here we are, we have a structure, and we can give you this glossy promise, and we'll, you know, do the right thing by your children. I can't, as a parent who's raised children now, I can't really fault my parents for wanting that for us, and going up against a machine like that had no accountability. There was no standard for evidence. There was no transparency in what was happening. they certainly weren't being upfront about what they were intending. And in a large sense, let's give a little nuance to it. I don't think our leadership was truly aware of what was rising in their congregation.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you talk a lot about the mega church really selling this glossy reality that's not really reality. It's really a facade. And I saw you in Shiny Happy People on Prime, and something that docuseries talked a lot about is the Duggars, of course, and how they kind of personified this, fake reality that you also discuss in your book. And one aspect of that I think we've also seen and maybe become more aware of slowly in mainstream is the idea of the trad wife and using fundy baby voice. And we want to hear you talk more about that. But first, we want to play a video for our audience so that they understand what we're talking about here, where that kind of fundy baby voice, fundy mom persona is on display, but in a political setting. So this is a clip from Alabama Senator Katie Britt's speech that she delivered after President Biden's State of the Union address in March.
Good evening, America. My name is Katie Britt, and I have the honor of serving the people of the great state of Alabama in the United States Senate. However, that's not the job that matters most. I am a proud wife and mom of 2 school-aged kids. Mr. President, enough is enough. We are steeped in the blood of patriots who overthrew the most powerful empire in the world. Our future starts around kitchen tables just like this. May God bless you, and may God continue to bless these United States of America.
So everything from her outfit, her tone of voice, her very particular manner of speaking and delivering, the fact that she's sitting at her kitchen table, this really seems tailor-made to be, she's portraying what it means to be a well-trained wife in many ways in this video. What are your thoughts on this, and does this kind of fundy baby voice and how it's displaying now in the political arena really blatantly, how does this resonate with you or relate to your experiences?
Yeah, when that first aired and I watched that live, I was horrified, because one hallmark of my work coming forward, and the reason why I'm doing this work, is because the fundamentalism that I'm from is now it's attempting to run our country, and it has risen in our political realm. And that moment was a solid point of, there it is. That's a dog whistle to believers. That is the reflection of a lifetime of training. The fact that Katie Britt is able to code switch and use her normal tone of voice in other settings is just evidential that she knows when to turn it on. We didn't call it fundy baby voice. We called it keeping sweet, or being childlike, or sounding feminine. She even knows how to yell in her breathy whisper. That's important. You want to never sound like an adult grown woman. You want to never sound threatening or in authority. You want to be warm and nurturing and come along. And it's this prosody that is used to coax preschoolers. It's a maternal sound that we do it instinctively when we're trying to get someone to come along now. If you want to lead an animal or lead a small child. You definitely don't want men to think that you're leading with authority, because, just use examples like Kamala's laugh is being under criticism right now. Also, Hillary Clinton's voice has been scrutinized. All women in politics who speak with their big girl voice are held accountable. And Katie Britt was sending a signal. I'm safe because I will not threaten you, and I will lead. There's this level in patriarchy where women can lead. They can assume a certain position as long as they're reflecting to the men, and that they're used to bring along other women. And it's only for a time. Once men are ultimately in control, we know women don't have any power. We know that by looking at their households and in their church organizations. So that is the same model scaled up. And fundy baby voice is, I'm so grateful it has a name now. because that's outsiders putting that name on that. But that, you know, it helps us educate as to how subtle the conditioning is and how it will even take away your own voice. When I used Fundy Baby Voice, and I used that tone of voice in my day-to-day life, I wasn't fully aware. I just knew I didn't sound like how I would naturally sound, and I had to constantly modify myself and tone it down, bring it in, practice. And then when I got out, I had to go through speech therapy in order to retain the sound of my own voice again, which was definitely a part of my trauma recovery and healing.
That's wild. Well, staying on this topic, it's so interesting to many of us, the allure there seems to be for this trad wife lifestyle. Obviously, as you're aware, it's sort of become a social media lifestyle phenomenon. One popular TikTok user is the Ballerina Farm, has nearly 10 million followers, kind of pushing this trad life or trad wife life. A lot of times it's videos of wives making dinner for their family, or, you know, doing things that capture that stereotypical, you know, nuclear, straight, cis family. What do you think is the reason so many people today like to watch content like this when so few of us are actually fundamentalists?
Yeah, I think that's it's comforting, and it's comforting by design. There's two things at work. Number one is this, like Katie Britt mentioned, that home and hearth, kitchen table, nurturing my family is the most important thing, more than anything else I do. Kind of messaging that is very consistent. It's very attractive and appealing from an aesthetic standpoint. When we're tired and we're overworked and we want something soothing, we want our mothers. So, you know, it can be very soothing to watch a pie being made or something done slowly and homey. And it does seem like this simple life is an easier way to live. It makes us hypnotized in a way so that we don't remember the facts of what it was actually like to live that way. There's a reason why humanity evolved beyond prairie life. But we forget that when we're watching a beautiful ballerina slowly and melodically go through her day. And we forget that her children are off screen and that there are abuses that are showing their red flags all over. When I watch that content, I'm like, ping, 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 red flags. But that's because I have a trained eye to see it and I know what I'm looking for. The other flip side of that is that high control environments and patriarchy especially can only get us to change our culture through high control and legislation so far. They really need our buy-in and our cooperation. So selling us attractive solutions to the life that they have made more difficult is the way that they're going. If they gave us child care and health care and reproductive freedom and agency and safe schools, we would not be so exhausted that we need to watch a Little House on the Prairie to calm our minds. But that's what the world that they've created. And so then we willingly choose. I call it like you're willingly getting into your cage because, oh, isn't this lovely? And your critical thinking goes offline. And so it's an important bait and switch that we need to be paying attention to.
You're so right. It's so exploitative. Like as a, you know, a full-time working mom of three, it's this exploitation of the fact that like everyone is so exhausted and overworked and oh, by the way, patriarchy still affects all of us non-fundamentalist women who are, you know, raising kids with men not in fundamentalist households, and it's exhausting. And so there's this exploiting of the fact that even women who are not like attracted to being a trad wife, where it's just like, oh, but her life looks so easy, right? Because like all she has to do is make her crackers and like, you know, tidy up her house and, you know, it's like trying to make attractive this sort of like simpler time, even if the simpler time means that, you know, women are submissive to men and everyone's in their proper place and it's totally toxic and traumatic. You know, you don't see that part. You just see the part that looks calm and she looks so well rested and right. It's just this sort of it's this exploitation of yeah. What other problems patriarchy has wrought, right, in our culture writ large, not just in the fundamentalist universe.
Yeah, I think it's a really dangerous lie. The reality is that Ballerina Farm is a huge industry. She's making a lot of money doing this. She has support, she has help, she has resources. Um, the people who emulate her, the next tier down, those are the women struggling in poverty. It is not fun to be home alone without any agency, and your children need a snack. And so the only option you have is to try and make them cheese crackers so they can kind of feel like, oh, we're getting cheese crackers too. But they're hungry. They're hungry. You can't just go buy a bag of Cheez-Its and move on with your day. It interferes with your ability to homeschool because, of course, you're homeschooling. And the times when they did the expose of Ballerina Farm, the cracks are showing. She is exhausted. She is having a hard time getting out of bed for whole weeks at a time. Those are the signs of adrenal fatigue. It's coming for her too. No one is exempt from that. You cannot have 8 children and then go parade yourself in a beauty pageant and have this empire, and you're somehow not going to pay the same toll that everyone else does. Childcare and repeated pregnancies are hard on the human body, period, no matter what. And it's a relevant part of the conversation. And she has reproductive freedom because she's making her choices. We really need to emphasize that for everyone. And that's one of the biggest dangers with that child life is the message is the way we live is right for everyone. And we're going to put our values into your government so that you don't have choices. And then it's not so lovely.
Yeah, it's an illusion.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that illusion not only robs you of your agency, but if you're indoctrinated, like you've talked about in your book and other interviews, is you end up in a situation where you're not only unequipped to get yourself out of the situation, but you're unequipped to even recognize that the situation is maybe a bad one to even be in. You're unequipped to recognize violence, abuse, whether it's physical, mental, emotional. You're not able to recognize the extent to which you're being coerced, whether it's overt coercion or, very subtle indirect coercion. So can you talk a little bit about how you were, indoctrinated into a reality where you weren't even able to recognize the extent that you were being abused, and then what eventually made you realize how wrong everything was around you?
That's a great question. I really hope that one of the biggest outcomes of my story is that we have compassion on younger us and realize that we didn't have access to the language and the vocabulary, education. That's one of the side effects of indoctrination, is that they control what you have access to. And as a culture, some of that stuff had not been available yet. So, but if I had had psychological awareness, if they had taught me how to recognize the signs of abuse, if they had responded to my outcry when I said, hey, I'm being abused, if I'd had sex education, if I'd had any kind of secular resources. The problem with religious resources is that their first loyalty is to their ideology. It's not to the humanity that you are and what you're experiencing. And so it took my my character arc through that to learn that I'm not their priority, and I'm not my own priority, because I've been taught to gaslight myself and bypass my feelings and suppress my feelings. Coming to the realization was a breaking point. It wasn't, I wouldn't say very articulated or formed. It was simply an inability to suffer any further without dying. I knew that if we kept going, we had just a tiny fraction of survival left, and that would be it. And I wasn't willing, whatever else was out there, I was willing to risk it. I wasn't willing to keep doing this and have that be my outcome. I think ultimately I wasn't willing to die for it. And that's what got me out. And all of my language and vocabulary and resources that came after the fact, both for me personally and as a community and culture, deconstruction, religious trauma, those kinds of terms weren't available in 2007. My escape was harrowing and at midnight and desperate. And I didn't, like, PTSD was being barely discussed outside of wartime, war veterans at the time.
So you're kind of touching on this period of time after you left and after your deconstruction and your reckoning with your own trauma. What in that process inspired you to dedicate your time to helping others break away from these cycles and Christian patriarchy? What kind of brought you to that place of that's what you want to do with your time and your talent?
Desperation. And then I have to tell you, self-preservation too. So my recovery process, I decided pretty early on that I'd given so much of my life, my youth, my children's childhoods, my hopes and dreams, so much had been lost and given. And I didn't want any more of my life to give ground to that. I didn't know how to change that and what to do about it, but it made me willing to try anything any physician or therapist put in front of me. And so I went on this journey, which led me to realize I'd had no self-actualization, no self-development, no agency, self-advocacy, nervous system regulation, protection. There's a whole host of things I had to discover that I needed to develop within myself. And so part of that was journaling. And I started writing my story and telling it and seeing it externalized on the page, helped me come to a place of acceptance. And then I was also in some 12-step groups that very gently gave me a structure for being in a different phase of recovery at different times. And the 12th step is to reach back and help others. So that point in my life where I realized I've come this far in my recovery, we're talking about a 10-year span after my escape, coincided with what was happening in our politics and in our government. And I realized that the life that I escaped was coming from my whole country. The two and two just went together. I couldn't stay silent. The only way anyone's going to know what it's like to live in Christian patriarchy is for somebody who's lived it to tell what it's like. There's very few people who can do that because there's number one, very few survivors. Number two, there's very few who have done the therapeutic work to not re-traumatize themselves in the telling. And I knew I had the third option there, I could write. And so I knew what I could do and how to do it. And so I did it. And that's why we're here.
Well, the book is so good. It's so beautifully written, in addition to being an amazing story to tell. It's heartbreaking, but it's also really just vulnerable and moving. And so I really appreciate that you wrote it. But aside from writing the book, you've actually also been doing a lot of educating people about Christian fundamentalism with your social media presence. You have a series on TikTok where you explain fundy fundamentals, which we love. We're going to play one of your videos here just to kind of show what I'm talking about. And you explain in this video what a quiverful is.
Fundy fundamentals. What is a quiverful? The word quiverful is based on a Bible verse that compares children to arrows in the hands of a warrior. It's in the book of Psalms, and it says that happy is the man that has a quiver full of them. You know, because when you're going into battle, you want a lot of arrows. So not only does it objectify children as an idea and as a weapon from the start, the quiverful is problematic in lots of ways. In order to compare children as an object like arrows in the first place, you have to already be in a war mindset. I mean, most of us say our babies are cute, our children are precious, and we're really happy to have them. But when you're having them because you're preparing for a holy war, that changes things. The average parent is kind of bent on not sending their children to war. Some quiverful try to soften the war analogy and say it's metaphorical. That's when they start talking about head count and voters and elections and the spread of ideas.
I love that. And you alluded to this earlier, talking about the quiverful, but it is so rooted in that war footing, that idea that, you know, everything in fundamentalist culture is about this battle between a fundamentalist religion and like the secular world, which we deal with so much in our work. And then also the age-old kind of cop-out, which is, no, it's metaphorical, but also it's still about a war. It's just a cultural war. And I think you have such an interesting and kind of easy way of explaining that with your social media videos. We love them. I want to talk about parenting in the fundamentalist kind of well-trained wife world. You talk about being advised to train infants, you know, to obey commands, basically, just as if they're already in this military, you know, soldier kind of framing. Can you share any of the other kind of just shocking mothering advice you were given when you were in that place by church elders, anything that, you know, felt wrong or dissonant with you, but that you took in, internalized as you were figuring out how to be a mother?
Yeah, there's so much. I was a maternal child. I think you can understand that. I always wanted children. I babysat young. I was nurturing. I was an experienced nanny when I became a mom. So I already knew the ins and outs of infant care, and I had no worries about that. And so it's kind of ironic to me that I ended up in this situation. But it started right away. I got pregnant very quickly after I was married, and I had an erratic, violent husband. I needed to keep my baby quiet. I needed to try to control the violence in the home so that it wasn't putting him at risk. And that was right around the time John MacArthur's Preparation for Parenting plan was released. And since my pastor and John MacArthur were friends, we became part of the pilot program at that church. So it started from before my baby was even born, this idea that infants are born with sin in their hearts, and they will manipulate you into eating too much if you don't put them on this routine. And so there's a very strict approach to teaching them to sleep through the night, not come into family bed, do not be too attached or too nurturing. And you're kind of supposed to break their spirit, you know, kind of right away in early infancy. And I was handed this book, and I participated in the study, and then that led me to the mentors that I talk a lot about in my work. So there was a group of women in our church that were quiverful moms. They were affiliated with Bill Gothard's Institute of Basic Life Principles, and they were all moms of 8 to 10 children. And when I needed help, I thought, well, I'm going to follow Titus 2 in the Bible. It says, let the older women teach the younger women to be keepers of the home and love their husbands. And so that's the model that we were supposed to trust. And even today, you know, we go trust an older, wiser woman who's been there, done that. You know, it's, I think it's feminine to some extent. And so I asked these moms for advice, and I have sort of a creative, structural mind where I want to suss out how something is done. And the thing that I was most curious about was, all right, I know how to take care of a baby, but how do you take care of 8 babies? How do you afford on a single income to have a quiver full? I'm all about obeying God, and, you know, okay, if you say that's what I have to do, how do I do that? And that led to behavior after behavior, practice after practice, that we just didn't do. There are things that the world, that healthy psychology, evidence-based science would all say is a good, normal part of parenting. And I certainly grew up, even growing up in this evangelical world, I grew up with certain assumptions that children needed things. And the quiverful mentors just told me no. And I've made this a series on my social media. It's things my Gothard Fundy mentors said I could skip to have a quiverful. It is a list of, I think, over 50 things at this point that people are horrified to hear, but I use the same language that my mentors used to convince me that we shouldn't go to pediatricians, gynecologists, educate our girls, vote, wear pants, stay up at night, deny our husbands. I mean, it's a long list.
How much of that advice was aimed at sort of, you know, making deprivation sound like it was part of God's plan for like practical financial reasons, and how much of that was about like the patriarchal control and like the physical, like, don't worry if you don't want to have sex, you have to you know, be available to your husband and be submissive, and like that part of the project, the quiverful project?
Yeah, it's a lot of both. And I mean, everything is got a short-term justification that they try to make sense. And, you know, in that case, it was, if it's going to interfere with you having more babies, then you need to stop doing it. If it's going to make it harder for you to say yes to God, then it shouldn't be on your plate. And that is the short-term strategy that they're using for the larger term goal. They need, and it's important to emphasize that this whole movement is founded in white supremacy and in majority rule dominionist theology. They need that majority and that dominion. And so in order to get it, they need women procreating endlessly. In order to help women procreate endlessly, they're going to have to simplify their lives. So that it's a chain. It's all both and.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And on your website, you have some quick cheat sheets. One of them is like the fundamentals cheat sheet, which I think we have a graphic of where you touch on a lot of these things. And you've also made TikToks where you discuss these issues. And one really obvious overlap that you've also identified is Project 2025 essentially bakes all of this and then some into its extreme Christian fundamentalist agenda. For example, earlier you touched on how, in your example, for you, if you didn't leave the situation, you were going to die, and, your children were also going to be harmed, and something that Project 2025 recently, people have noticed that it wants to get rid of no-fault divorce, which no-fault divorce has, pretty clearly led to a drastic decrease in domestic violence and women dying from domestic violence. So just as one example, do you want to talk a little bit more about the overlaps between fundamentalism and Project 2025 from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember how long Project 2025 has been a thing. Its architects have been working on it for 50 years, which parallels this entire timeline that we've been discussing. Their roots are in white supremacy, the most conservative movements. All of the organizations have had a hand in this politicizing evangelical history. They're big names that we recognize: James Dobson, Franklin Graham, Falwell. These are big, Michael Ferris. These are big names, and so it's been a long, ongoing initiative. It just gets a little branded differently here and there, but they, want their man in the White House, and it is definitely a man, and it's definitely a white man, and it is. They'll do anything they have to do to get it, which times really well with the evangelical endorsement of Trump in his first campaign. When Roe was overturned, one of my loudest talking points was this: hey, this is not where they stop. Because everyone assumed they were fighting so hard to protect Roe, and everyone assumed that this was this pinnacle moment for the pro-life movement and for the evangelicals, and that it would not go any further. And I was like, there's absolutely nothing in Christian patriarchy to suggest that they stop there. That's not where they stop at home. That's not where they stop in their churches. That's just the first opening portal. They need to get that one so that then they can come for contraception and IVF and working rights and DEI and divorce. And so here we are today having this conversation about something like no-fault divorce, which way back before Roe, people would have said, oh, they're not going to go after that. That's got too much good research attached to it, testimony. They're absolutely going to go for it. All we have to do is look at the way they live in their homes. There's no divorce allowed in those homes, so there's not going to be divorce allowed for American women. And that will go for anything else. It has yet to fail me. If that's how it is in a patriarch's home, it's not happening in the country if they're in control.
How do you convince people? I'm literally asking this as someone who's trying to do this project as well, because I love that you talk openly from your unique experience about how you see Project 2025, and what you see in that is a reflection of those hardcore patriarchal fundamentalist values that you were, so traumatized by in your early life. We try to draw that through line, like Christian nationalism and this, white Christian patriarchy is undergirding this whole project. But sometimes it's hard to make that case when it's 900 pages and so much of it is about the administrative state and, all of these personnel and bureaucratic reform. I mean, that's a euphemism, obviously, but some of it seems so divorced from cultural issues and things like Roe. How do you simply describe that through line? Is it just look who's behind it, or is it something more?
A lot of times I center survivors and I say, just listen to their stories and you'll see those things reflected. I think another valid point is the very format that they're using is part of their methodology. The fact that it's 900 pages and overwhelming and dull and dry is important. That is what it's like to live in their world. It's extensive, it's tedious, it's dull and dry. That is like the videos that just leaked. ProPublica, released those training videos. There wasn't a lot of gotcha moments in them. By design, they're dull. Like they look like every homeschooling video course I've ever seen, in a homeschooling convention. And I was going to make content and just haven't had a chance to because I've been releasing a book. But yeah, I think that's part of it. And I think just learning to speak to somebody about the issues that are important to them is important. It depends. It's a little different which swim lane you're in and what's relevant. They don't need to go topic by topic in order to make radical cultural change. They just need to get in control. So picking the really big points that are allowing them to have this imbalance is important. I love, actually, and ironically, the counterpoint of joy in the current campaign, because there's so little joy in Christian patriarchy and so little agency and diversity and freedom, and seeing that enthusiasm, that's attraction, and that's honey. You do catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So just putting my energy sometimes into a positive place is sometimes the best way to combat the negativity that's happening over there, because they are small, they are narrow, they are antiquated, they go backwards. And I want a progressive society that moves forward. I want humanity to advance. I want better things for my children and grandchildren than what my grandmother experienced. So sometimes I just switch the conversation and refuse to engage on tedious, dull topics.
Well, one more question from us, and then we're going to see if there's live questions. But kind of on that note, where do you see the future of the fundamentalist quiverful movement, or even just the evangelical movement, which I guess is maybe a little broader? We always sort of try to look at the demographics and the changes that we're seeing and be encouraged by that. I wonder if you see this lifestyle and ideology dying out or surging, or how you kind of think about the future of the movement.
Oh, a lot remains to be seen. November is critical.
Yeah.
It's so critical. If they win, it means bad things for almost everybody that's not a straight white man in control. And that includes the beta men who are not in control. It means bad things for education, obviously, because they want to get rid of the Department of Education. It means bad things for desire for diversity and for all of the progress that we've made through the civil rights movement and equality, and all of it will just go away. It'll go away very quickly, and our choices will narrow quickly and narrow and be into that stark, dark, no options, uphill battle again. We've seen this repeat in history, so I know it's totally possible to happen again. Mm-hmm. We should not ever be so arrogant as Americans to think that our progress is something we can take for granted. It's clearly not. Now, if they lose in November, particularly if they lose big and includes the House and the Senate, I'm encouraged by that, because I think that love wins. I think that positivity and education and literacy and access to education and all the conversations that we're having will gain ground and hold traction. And to a large extent, some of this will die out because it's generational. And the younger generations haven't been indoctrinated with this. They've only known the internet. They've only known access to information. They didn't grow up in such a highly controlled environment. So I think it means good things for humanity. And it really does come down to this election. It's that critical.
Yeah. We've got some audience questions I'm going to throw out there. Some of these are really interesting to me, so I want to start a conversation. Tia, how do you think about the difference, or do you think there's much of a real difference between Christian patriarchy, like what you experienced, and the patriarchy at large in our culture? I think about this all the time. I live in the broader culture and never lived in the, uber religious culture. I was raised, culturally Catholic, which is not a very pious existence either. And you talked at the very end of your book, you kind of had a note. It's kind of like a trigger warning for trauma, but also you mentioned for those readers who all this doesn't actually sound so fringe. And that really resonated with me, because even though this is a you had a very kind of extreme experience. So much of the just like soft patriarchy that you were being taught, how to be a woman, how to be a people pleaser, how to be a carer, how to, use soft power and not, overt power. So much of that, we all as women in the culture know that experience. And I'm just so curious how you think about the difference between that patriarchy and sort of our more mainstream patriarchal system. Obviously, they relate.
That's a great question. Yeah, they do. They do relate. And thank you for this question. It's so relevant. I think that with the way I think about it, I create more of a line. It's misogyny and inequality that we still as a culture have to deconstruct when it's in the general sense. I'm encouraged when we talk about it because it helps us confront and unpack and tease apart these things that we might have taken for granted in our traditions and in our, our family cultures and political cultures, school culture, that kind of thing. When you put Christianity into it, you're speaking about a very intentional agenda of high control and global dominance. It is an escalation of patriarchy, but it is using that gasoline in its engine. And it's in a way that's familiar to us. So it might not be immediately obvious. I can't even tell you how many women I meet that they trust some brand of the patriarchy because that's how their dad was, and that's what's familiar, and that feels safe. And it takes them a minute or many, many minutes to sit with, is this working for us? How did that work for us? Do I want to feel this marginalized as a woman? It takes a certain courage to unpack the family influences of your history, your personal history. So I deal with it very individually that way. And it is, I just all think it's part of an evergreen organic conversation we need to keep having.
Yeah. Do you think that physical or mental abuse is the backbone of controlling a fundamentalist wife? Trad wife is something I think maybe a little bit different, but that's what the question says. But in the fundamentalist household, how essential is abuse to the high control?
No, I get a flip side version of this question often is are they always abusive? I don't, by listening to survivors, if I'm taking my evidence from survivors, I would say yes. There's a range of that. Sometimes it's verbal and psychological abuse. Sometimes it's narcissistic dynamics. If there's not equality or freedom to say yes, you're not free to say no. I think that I have not yet heard a survivor come out of fundamentalism who wants to talk about their experience that doesn't include an abusive component. So while I don't want to come out and say every fundamentalist home is abusive, I have yet to meet one that doesn't involve corporal punishment on babies or young children or power dynamics that are unequal in the spouses. I don't know any of them. So that's my experience.
There's a couple of questions that kind of go together, so I'm going to ask them together. Someone asks this is obviously a huge question. You can speak to maybe others' experience because you told us about yours. How does one break free of this situation, and what are the resources for people in these closed situations?
Yeah, resources is the hardest part of that question because they're evolving. Again, earlier in the interview, I mentioned that this language and the resources that we have are still being developed, and it's starting to become included in the DSM disorders, and therapists are becoming trauma informed. And so there are more resources today than there used to be. How does somebody break free? It starts in your mind, just as indoctrination began in your mind. I believe that it begins in health. And so it's very hard if you've been in the Christian tradition like this to have any kind of prioritization to yourself without using this big bad S word, selfish. My second book is called The Soul of Healing. It'll be out in 2025, but the original working title of it was Selfish because I kind of had a sense of self when I came out, and my healing completely centered on putting myself together as a human being. I needed to first be who I was. I was 35 years old and I didn't know myself. I didn't know who I was, what I wanted, what I liked, anything unique about me. And I had reached this point in my faith where I was like, if I'm going to believe in God, then I need to know God believes in me. Sent me down a whole spiritual path that is very fluid and open today. But it also led me to self-actualize. And I think of someone who is healthy and strong in her own right. This is very similar to if there's a plane crash, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first. If you can be strong and healthy in your own right, you will make better decisions for the people that you're responsible for in the same room. So sometimes, especially for women, if you can think of it as you'll be a better mom if you're a better woman, you know, whatever you need to help encourage you to take those first early steps and hear yourself think. Let your doubts be. Yesterday in an interview, I said, if your question breaks God, then what does that say about your God? You should be, you know, like a big, omnipresent, all-powerful God should be able to handle you asking a question or having a doubt. And if you can't have it, then that's a red flag that you're in danger. So, yeah, I think it's very personal, but there's some commonalities in these journeys.
You know, Tia, before we let you go, you're making me think just about how important just education and information is in these cycles. And we work so hard on the sort of public education front, right? That's where 90% of our kids are getting their education, maybe not in these closed households, homeschooling households, but still. You know, how much different would your life have been if you had comprehensive sex education, if you had just access to information, if you had a smartphone in your pocket? You know, how do you think about the importance of comprehensive education, access to information, and sort of like, what are the preventive, you know, pieces, not just the antidote, but like how do we like inoculate our children, our culture against the influence of these systems that have like served us so poorly?
Yeah. So in my story, one of my favorite subplots is how I discovered a group of women called the Trapdoor Society. And it was really my connection with other women, conversations with other humans and other ways to be human that helped broaden my worldview, helped educate me, helped me put names and language to what I was experiencing and ultimately break free. And that's what I encourage. And that's what I got to do when I got out. When I left, my kids were 10 and under, and I got to reparent them and be the different kind of parent for their second half of their childhoods, which was definitely information heavy. I emphasize education, information, and a broad worldview as a way to inoculate, because it was exposure to those things that just helped me not fall under someone else's mind control. Just to know that there's another way of doing this and that it's valid for some people is very powerful, whether I choose it for myself or not. And just having that window out into society. I lean towards over-information. I don't know if there's such a thing as over-information. I've never been harmed from having too much information. I've experienced deathly harm from not having enough. So that's where I default to. I did have a public education in my personal background, and my children in their older years, we had that. I think we do have to protect secular education at all costs. You know, in the patriarchy, free secular education doesn't exist. Everyone's schooled in indoctrination schools. That's how they are taught. So we have to know that, believe it, take them seriously, protect our options, protect plurality, protect democracy, and just keep going. I mean, recovery is life. This isn't like a thing you finish and then you're done with it and that's it, you know.
That's a great place to stop. And thank you so much, Tia, for coming on to our show this week and talking with us about such a personal story. The book is amazing. Everyone should get it, read it, listen to it. It's really beautifully written. You're such a talented writer, and you have such an important story to tell. Can you let our viewers know where they can find you on social media, the best place they should buy your book?
Yeah, so the book's available everywhere, and it just debuted on the New York Times bestsellers list, so supply should be coming. Yay. It is available in hardcover, ebook, and audio, and I did read the audio myself. I always get that question. And I'm on all the social networks as at Tia Levings Writer. The only one I'm not on is Twitter because I don't do Elon, but I'm everywhere else. So I love to interact with people who are learning through my content. Feel free to ask me any questions. I'll do my best to answer them all. And thank you for your support and your readership.
Thank you, Tia, and congratulations on your book. It is gorgeous.
Thank you.
That wraps up our episode this week of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, we will be replaying an interview with the philosopher and the cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett from 2006. That was the year his book, Breaking the Spell, came out. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out our latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
We also have a lot of fun and irreverent merch available on our online store. There's t-shirts, bumper stickers, pins, coffee mugs, books, so much more. You can check out all that by visiting ffrf.org/shop.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom From Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.